The storm slammed into the airfield like a living force, ripping at the fences and rattling the windows of every building on base. In the hangar, the massive doors groaned against the wind as they parted just enough for one shadow to slip through. A lone Black Hawk blades, already spinning, rolled forward into the chaos with a guttural roar. Inside the cockpit, Captain Emily Rae sat calm and motionless, eyes locked on her instruments as the helicopter fought to lift. Rain lashed the windshield so hard it sounded like shattering glass, and the rotors screamed against the turbulence. She said nothing, not even to herself, just adjusted her grip and tilted the bird into the teeth of the storm. No clearance, no backup, no acknowledgement that this flight even existed. Lightning streaked the sky in angry slashes, throwing violent flashes across her face, and the whole machine shuddered as it broke free from the ground. She flew low, hugging the terrain, pushing the aircraft beyond safety, beyond reason, towards something only she seemed to believe was worth the risk. Behind her, the base sat quiet in lockdown, unaware that one of its own had decided not to wait. The storm wasn't the enemy. Not tonight. The silence in the cockpit felt almost sacred, like a moment of defiance whispered to the dark. She muttered softly, not as a prayer but as a promise. "Hold on, I'm coming." Emily Rae moved through the base like part of its structure, unnoticed by most, essential to many. She wore her uniform like it was just another layer of skin sleeves, always rolled boots, scuffed but clean. At 38, she had the quiet presence of someone who'd seen more than she shared and carried it with grace. She worked maintenance on the choppers now, usually second shift, slipping tools to younger techs and offering guidance without ever needing to raise her voice. Most thought she was a former mechanic, maybe once a transport pilot, the kind that faded into the background once her flying days were over. No one knew she used to fly lead for special operations, or that her call sign once cleared entire flight paths overseas. Emily didn't tell stories. Not about the crash that took her co-pilot and her husband both in one mission, or the months she spent grounded after. When she requested reassignment to support roles, no one questioned it. Paperwork was clean, her record flawless, and she never asked for sympathy. Now she kept close to the K-9 teams. She liked the dogs maybe more than most of the people. They didn't ask questions, didn't care about rank or past glories. She'd help run drills, repair gear, and keep treats in her pockets without anyone needing to say thank you. Sergeant Daniels once joked that if you ever got caught in the wild, you'd want Emily tracking your position. She knew terrain like memory and could read the sky better than the base weather systems. She shrugged it off, but her eyes said she'd heard it before and carried the weight of what it meant. Her apartment was small, neat, with a photo of her husband tucked in the corner of the mirror and a dog tag looped around the base of a lamp. On her days off, she'd run the perimeter trails or read old field manuals, sometimes just sit in the hangar long after lights out, listening to the hum of machinery like it still spoke to her. She never volunteered for praise and never took credit. If something broke, she fixed it. If someone was struggling, she showed up. She didn't lead teams anymore, but people followed her without realizing it. There was a strength in her silence, one that others leaned on when things got tough. No one ever said she was remarkable, at least not out loud. But when the wind picked up and orders got messy, the younger soldiers always seemed to look toward her. Like instinct knew something command hadn't noticed yet. Like somewhere under the layers of calm and routine, something powerful was still waiting. Ellsworth Air Base sat like a fortress under a darkening sky, its sharp lines and concrete silence bracing against the storm rolling in from the southeast. Radar towers blinked in rhythm, red lights pulsing against the clouds, as if marking time until impact. Inside, the command center buzzed with clipped voices and the hum of data streaming across screens. Orders moved fast, impersonal, clipped into code and acronyms as forecasts turned from cautious to dire. Winds had already grounded 2 regional units, but Ellsworth held its line. Protocol dictated readiness, and readiness meant pushing forward until a general said stop. On the far end of the base, technicians scrambled to lash down aircraft, their voices barely audible above the rising wind. Sandbags stacked at building entrances gave the place a war zone feel, though no shots had been fired. It was the kind of calm that meant everything could go wrong in minutes. The K-9 unit got their call anyway. A recon mission at the northern border, unusual movement caught by satellite, not enough to delay. Staff Sergeant Daniels and his partner Thor were selected as always. No one questioned the risk. No one dared raise their hand to challenge the chain of command. Emily heard it first from the supply log. She watched Daniels prep his gear, pat Thor behind the ears like it was any other day. But her stomach turned when she saw the forecast. The storm was gaining speed faster than predicted. The mission window was closing before they even took off. She brought it up in briefing only to be waved off. The colonel reminded the room that military decisions were based on threat assessment, not weather reports. Her voice didn't count, not when she was just a maintenance lead and not on the active flight roster. The hallways grew tighter as the afternoon wore on, filled with tension and the scent of cold metal and wet concrete. Everyone walked faster, spoke less. The base moved like a machine, parts grinding together to keep up appearances even when the gears felt off. Emily returned to the hangar, checked tie-downs she had already checked twice, anything to shake the feeling crawling up her spine. She glanced toward the motor pool where Daniels and Thor were loading up. They didn't look scared. That made it worse. The sky broke just before dusk, rain slashing sideways across the tarmac. Lightning danced in the distance like a warning no one wanted to read. Radios chirped with updates, each one pushing the danger level higher, but not high enough to stop anything. Back inside, the command staff gathered again. Charts and probabilities all built on numbers and confidence. No talk about the human side. No pause to ask if someone should have said no. Emily stood in the back of the room, unseen, listening. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The storm was already saying enough. Emily stood near the edge of the briefing room, hands resting on the back of an empty chair, her voice calm but firm as she pointed out the shift in barometric pressure and the projected path of the storm. She mentioned the narrowing window and how the recon team might be heading straight into a pressure collapse. No one turned to look except Captain Roy, who let out a soft laugh and shook his head. He walked over, smug in his spotless flight jacket, and tapped her weather map like it was a child's drawing. He told her she'd been in logistics too long, that a few clouds didn't ground recon. Around the table, no one challenged him, and the colonel didn't even glance up from his tablet. Emily didn't reply. She just folded her arms and watched as the final go order was given. Roy smirked on his way out, tossing a line over his shoulder about not needing a lecture from someone who hadn't flown in years. The door shut behind him with a click that sounded too final. She sat alone for a few minutes after the room cleared, staring at the forecast on her screen. The pressure drop wasn't subtle anymore. It was the kind of shift you only noticed if you'd flown in it before, if you'd seen how fast the sky could change when no one else believed it could. Her mind went to Daniels and Thor. She'd seen them train. She'd patched Thor's vest after a bad landing drill. They weren't just names on a roster to her. She knew their rhythms, their instincts. She trusted them more than the men making the calls. But trust didn't stop the storm, and the system didn't stop for warnings. Emily closed the laptop, heart tight in her chest, knowing no one would be there to say, "I told you so," if this went bad. No one would even remember who tried to speak up. The radio crackled and broke into static just as Daniels's voice cut out mid-sentence. A few clipped words about movement at the target, followed by a sudden silence that felt heavier than thunder. Around the command table, officers leaned in, fingers flying across keyboards, trying to re-establish the link. Emily stood at the back, arms folded, eyes locked on the screen. She could see the storm cell tightening the radar, blooming red over the outpost's coordinates. She stepped forward and laid her flight plan on the table, calm and exact, explaining the terrain shield and timing window she had calculated. Captain Roy rolled his eyes before she finished. He said no one was flying through that storm, not even for a live unit, let alone a dog. The colonel glanced once at the maps, then turned away, voice flat, as he issued the final word. No flights would be authorized until conditions changed. Another officer, younger, asked about alternatives. The colonel didn't flinch. The K-9 unit was classified as an acceptable loss under current threat conditions. The room went still, filled only by the low buzz of failing comms and the ticking of the storm clock. Emily didn't speak. Her face didn't move, but her hands clenched behind her back until her knuckles burned. She stared at the map, at the point where she knew her friends were trapped, probably injured, probably hoping someone was coming. But no one was. The rules said, wait. The storm said no, and the people in charge had already decided that some lives mattered more than others. Emily turned and left without a word, her boots echoing down the hallway, louder than they should have. The corridors were nearly empty, echoing with the distant howl of the wind and the occasional metallic creak from outside. Emily moved fast but careful, every step planned, every corner checked. Her gear was already packed and the flight data loaded onto her tablet, hidden in the lining of her jacket. She slipped into the hangar through the side access panel, avoiding the main checkpoint where two MPs huddled with coffee and storm radios. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the kind that buzzes under your skin. The emergency lights gave everything a dim, reddish hue, turning the row of helicopters into silent shadows. Black Hawk 3 sat near the end, half covered by its tarp, barely visible in the flickering light. Emily went straight to it, hands already unfastening the tie-downs, checking cables and hydraulics as she moved. Her fingers knew the rhythm, and her brain didn't need to think. It had been trained for this even if no one else knew it anymore. She climbed into the cockpit seatbelt tight across her chest, helmet snapped into place. The checklist ran through her mind like a prayer. Battery ignition, fuel status, navigation, hydraulic response. Each switch clicked like part of a larger decision already made. Rain pounded the metal shell as she powered up the rotors. Wind pushed against the sides, trying to keep her grounded, but she adjusted the pitch and watched the system indicators hold. She skipped the log entry, letting the screen time out without a touch. This flight wouldn't exist. The doors groaned as they opened just enough to let the nose of the bird slip out into the night. Lightning sliced the sky as the rotors took full speed, lifting the Black Hawk off the ground in a low, grinding climb. She angled toward the eastern ridge where her calculations told her the windbreak might give her a chance. Within seconds, the helicopter was caught in the fury. Wind slammed against the hull like fists trying to flip her sideways. Emily gritted her teeth and countered, body leaning into the stick muscles locking as she found balance through force and instinct. Visibility dropped to near zero. Rain smeared the windshield wipers, dragging uselessly. She flew mostly by feel, watching the altimeter and terrain scanner flicker under strain. The storm tried to throw her off course with every gust. She kept adjusting eyes, never leaving the panel for long. Her knuckles went white on the controls as the nose dropped into a sudden downdraft. The aircraft fell, fast engines whining under stress. Emily corrected with practiced calm, easing back just enough to catch the lift from the valley air. She whispered encouragement, not for herself, but for the machine. The eastern ridge rose ahead, jagged and wet, just visible in the flashes of lightning. She dipped low, hugging the terrain where the wind was less violent. The Black Hawk shook and strained, but it held together under her control. Every part of her was locked in. Breath muscle thought, like the air itself would punish hesitation. There were no backup systems now. If anything failed, she wouldn't make it back. But there was no room for doubt. Daniels and Thor were out there, and no one else was coming. She'd made a promise, and she didn't break those. The eye of the storm began to form ahead, a small lull in the chaos. It was the gap she had predicted, a 30-minute window of relative calm. She slid into it like slipping through a crack in a wall, the aircraft suddenly steadier, though still at the edge of control. Emily exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. She wasn't safe, not yet, but she was closer. The map showed the outpost just beyond the next ridge. She checked fuel, winced at the drop, and made her next move. She was flying against every rule. And still it felt like the only thing that made sense. Emily brought the Black Hawk down slow nose first, then settling into a hover above a narrow clearing near the outpost. The trees bent violently around her branches, whipping past the rotors. She could feel the tail slide with each gust, but she kept the bird steady, waiting for the skids to kiss the ground. The landing was rough but controlled. She left the engine running, unwilling to risk a cold start in these conditions. Her boots hit the mud hard, and the wind shoved her sideways before she got her balance back. The outpost looked broken. Its main roof half collapsed and the antenna sheared clean off. The lights were out. Doors hung open like mouths frozen mid-scream. She moved fast, flashlight beam cutting through the rain, calling out names into the storm that only answered back with silence. Inside, it smelled like wet wiring and dirt. Equipment lay scattered, a coffee cup turned over on the floor, a jacket still on the back of a chair. No bodies, no blood, just absence. Her heart pounded faster than the wind outside. She checked room after room, careful calling again. In the corner of what had once been a comm station, she spotted a shattered tablet flickering weakly. The screen showed the last image captured, grainy and water-streaked. Crates of vehicle and a man she knew shouldn't have been there. She copied everything to her own device and slipped it into her vest hand, trembling only once. A low growl stopped her in her tracks. The flashlight swung around and caught a pair of glowing eyes just inside the door. Thor stood in the frame, soaked and shivering, one paw dragging slightly. He didn't bark. He just stared at her like he'd been waiting. Emily knelt low, whispering his name. The dog hesitated, then limped forward and pressed his head against her chest. She ran her hands along his side, feeling for breaks, but all she found was tension and exhaustion. When she asked about Daniels, he turned sharply and limped out into the dark. She followed. Through the thick rain, down a shallow ravine slick with mud and half covered in debris. Her boots slipped more than once, but Thor never paused, moving like something was pulling him forward. At the bottom, under the edge of an overhanging rock, Daniels lay half covered in a rain tarp. His face was pale, lips cracked, one arm twisted at the wrong angle. Emily dropped to her knees and checked his pulse. Weak, but there. She muttered his name and he stirred, not fully conscious, just enough to groan when she touched his shoulder. Hypothermia was already setting in. She wrapped him in the thermal blanket and set to work assembling the emergency stretcher. It wasn't built for this kind of terrain, and Daniels was heavier than she remembered. Thor didn't wait for a command. He grabbed a strap in his teeth and started pulling as she lifted the back. They moved together step by step, inch by inch. The climb back to the chopper was worse than the flight. Wind pushed them down. Mud swallowed her boots. Twice they had to stop and rest, and every time she thought about leaving the stretcher behind, Thor looked at her like quitting wasn't an option. By the time they reached the clearing, her arms were shaking and her vision blurred with sweat and rain. The Black Hawk was still running, though one of the side panels flapped loose, torn from the frame. She hauled Daniels in with the last of her strength and strapped him down with one arm. Thor climbed in next and collapsed beside his partner chest, rising in shallow breaths. Emily pulled herself back into the pilot's seat and took a long breath. The gauges were dropping. Fuel low. Time almost gone. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She looked back once, saw Thor lift his head and look at her. She gave him a nod, simple and firm. "We're going home. One way or another." The landing was rough skids grinding against wet concrete rotors, still slowing when the side door slid open. Medics rushed in, pulling Daniels onto a stretcher, Thor limping after barely able to walk. Emily climbed out last, soaked boots caked in mud, her body swaying with fatigue but standing firm. Colonel Harding was already striding toward her, face red with fury, voice cutting through the rain. He called her reckless insubordinate, accused her of endangering the base. Before she could speak, he ordered her detained and stripped of her clearance. Military police stepped forward, hesitant but obedient hands moving to restrain her. Emily didn't flinch. She reached into her vest and held out the tablet, her voice calm and quiet. She said Daniels had found something, and now she had the proof. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy images of crates, unmarked trucks, and a man standing too close to the cargo. A few gasps broke from the crowd. The angle shifted, revealing Harding's face clear in the frame, speaking with men no one recognized. The air went still. Harding stopped mid-step, eyes locked on the screen, jaw clenched. Someone in the crowd whispered. One of the tech officers stepped back. The MPs froze, unsure what to do. Emily stood still, the tablet steady in her hands. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at Harding and said he had been willing to let a man and a dog die to protect a deal he wasn't supposed to make. Harding's voice cracked as he told her she didn't know what she was interfering with. He tried to spin it, said it was classified, said she was misinformed. But the room wasn't listening to him anymore. The power had shifted. No one had raised a weapon. No one shouted. But in that moment, Emily wasn't the one on trial. He was, and everyone could feel it. Before anyone could speak again, a sharp voice cut through the crowd. A woman in civilian dress stepped forward from a black SUV that had pulled onto the edge of the landing pad. She held up credentials as two agents in tactical gear flanked her. Her tone was even official and final. She identified herself as Intelligence Officer Clara Blackwood, speaking on behalf of the Defense Integrity Command. With no hesitation, she announced that Colonel Harding and Captain Roy were under investigation for weapons trafficking and abuse of authority. She motioned to her agents, and they moved in with quiet precision. Harding sputtered, tried to protest, but no one moved to help him. Roy stepped back, face pale, hands raised, looking around like he expected someone to defend him. No one did. The MPs who had almost arrested Emily stood still, not interfering. A second figure emerged behind Blackwood, General Langston from Special Operations. His face was lined, voice steady as he looked directly at Emily. He addressed her as Captain Rae, Special Investigations Command, verifying her role and commending her actions. Gasps spread through the group and a shift rippled across the tarmac. Technicians and enlisted personnel straightened. The officers who had dismissed her went quiet. The woman they thought was just a mechanic had more flight hours and clearance than anyone on base. Langston explained that Emily had been embedded at Ellsworth for 14 months, tracking internal leaks and missing weapons shipments. They had suspicions, but no proof. That proof now sat in her hands. Her mission had been observation, not confrontation. But Harding's decision to silence Daniels forced her hand. Emily stood motionless as they spoke. She didn't look proud. She looked tired. But behind the fatigue was something more solid than rank. She had risked her life not for orders, but for truth, and now everyone saw it. As Harding was led away, the silence deepened. Then someone clapped. One medic, then another. Soon the sound filled the landing pad, a slow build of recognition that this wasn't just a victory. It was the unmasking of someone who had stood alone and stood right. The sun was barely up when Emily sat across from General Langston in a quiet corner of the operations tent. Around them, the base hummed with cleanup crews and returning order. Reporters had started calling. Awards were being drafted. But she wasn't interested. She didn't want medals or promotions or to have her name on a press release. She had done what needed to be done. That was enough. When the general asked her what came next, she didn't hesitate. She told him about an idea she'd been carrying for months, a K-9 air rescue program, one that trained pilots and handlers together, built teams that could reach remote disaster zones fast. She said they had seen it work, that Thor and Daniels had proved the concept in the worst storm in 50 years. Langston listened without interrupting. He nodded once, then asked how many helicopters she would need. Emily blinked, not sure he was serious. He was. He said he didn't need heroes. He needed systems. She had built one with grit and instinct. Now he wanted her to lead it. She said yes, quietly. There was no speech, no handshake photo. Just a simple agreement that something good should come from what had nearly been buried. She asked to remain stationed at Ellsworth, said it felt right to start the program where it had been born. Before he left, Langston looked at her and said she had done something rare. Not just brave, but decent. He told her that kind of courage lasted longer than rank. Emily thanked him, then returned to the hangar. Later that day, she visited Daniels in recovery. He was groggy, arm in a cast, but awake. Thor rested at the foot of his bed. She sat beside him, not saying much. He already knew what she'd done. He smiled once, eyes full of something deeper than thanks. It was trust intact after everything. Emily didn't call herself a hero. She called herself lucky. Lucky the rotor held. Lucky she found them in time. But everyone else knew it was more than that. They saw how she moved, how she planned, how she never once thought of herself first. In the end, it wasn't the storm that defined her. It was what she chose to do after it passed. She took the pieces of something broken and turned them into the start of something better. Not for recognition, not even for legacy, just because it was right. The hangar looked different now. Cleaner, more focused, with 4 modified Blackhawks lined up in formation and a row of handlers moving through drills beside their dogs. Morning light spilled through the open doors, casting long shadows across the floor, where fresh paint spelled out the new division name, K-9 Air Rescue. Emily stood near the briefing table watching as a young pilot checked her pre-flight list with quiet focus. The dog beside her sat, alert gear already secured. The pair reminded her of herself once back, before everything changed, before people saw her for what she really was. The transformation hadn't been overnight. It took months to train the dogs, longer to find pilots who could fly low and think fast. They ran practice rescues in simulated storms, dropping into ravines and flooded fields, pulling dummies from rooftops. Real emergencies came soon enough, and they answered every time. Thor remained by Emily's side now, with a custom vest and more missions behind him than most humans could claim. He had a new limp, a scar over one eye, but he never let it slow him down. She trusted him more than any machine in the bay. She walked the line, checking gear, nodding to crew leaders. One pilot stopped to ask about wind speeds along the canyon routes. Emily adjusted their plans slightly, showing them a better entry point. The younger woman smiled and jogged back to her bird without hesitation. They had built something solid, a unit built not from tradition or orders, but from grit and faith, and a shared promise that no one got left behind. On the wall near the door, a small plaque hung in clean bronze. It read, "Courage isn't flying when conditions are perfect. It's flying when no one else will." A tech ran over headset crackling voice tight with urgency. Flash flooding in the east. Border patrol trapped on high ground. Conventional support couldn't reach them in time. Emily listened, eyes already scanning the weather map. She gave a single nod and pointed to her bird. Her team moved fast, practiced ready. Thor rose beside her, tail wagging once before settling into his harness. As she climbed into the cockpit, the others followed her lead without question. She didn't need to say much. The mission was clear. The engines fired up rotors, cutting through the wind as the helicopter lifted off the ground. From below, the new recruits watched, inspired and ready. Emily glanced at Thor, felt the weight of the moment, and smiled. They weren't chasing glory. They were answering a call, and they were ready.